"I'd like to make a toast," Brandon announced, raising his glass. The chatter in his new Denver home died down as all eyes turned to him. I recognized that glint in his eye, the same one he always had when he was about to command attention. To new beginnings, new homes, and... He paused for effect, his voice dipping into something solemn. To Grandpa's memory. A respectful silence fell over the room. 4 days. That's how long it had been since we lost him, and the wound still felt raw. I lifted my glass, swallowing the ache in my throat. Then Brandon set his drink down, his fingers brushing the rim of the coffee table as if steadying himself for something big. "Speaking of Grandpa," he continued, reaching into his pocket, "I have an announcement to make." My stomach clenched. There was something away he glanced at me, too fleeting, too careful. He pulled out an envelope, its edges slightly worn. "Before he passed, Grandpa gave me this letter." His voice carried across the living room, steady and certain. "He wanted me to have the vacation home by the lake." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. The room erupted in murmurs and congratulations. My parents beamed, Brandon's girlfriend Vanessa clapped excitedly, and my cousin Megan caught my gaze from across the room, her confusion mirroring my own. Frozen. The lakeside cabin, Grandpa's most cherished place. The same place where I'd spent almost every weekend for the past 3 years, helping him maintain the property, listening to his stories, just being there when no one else was. Brandon, on the other hand? He'd visited maybe twice in 5 years, always complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi and nothing to do. But that wasn't even the part that had my head spinning. 3 weeks ago, Grandpa had given me a small wooden box. "When the time is right," he'd said with that knowing smile, "you'll understand." Inside was a notarized deed. His signature, legally transferring ownership of the vacation home to me. Not to the estate. Not up for debate. To me. So why was Brandon standing here, so sure of himself, reading a letter supposedly written by Grandpa? I studied his face as he unfolded the paper. Was he lying? Did he know? Had Grandpa somehow changed his mind and not told me? "That's great, Brandon. Good for you," I forced out, my voice carefully even. But inside my thoughts were a hurricane. I needed to see those documents. Now. I excused myself, muttering something about the bathroom, and slipped away from the celebration. As soon as I shut the door behind me, I braced my hands against the sink, breathing hard. The letter didn't make sense. Grandpa's handwriting had grown shaky in his final months. Years of arthritis had made sure of that. But the signature I glimpsed on that page? Smooth. Confident. Too perfect. My phone buzzed. "Megan, you okay?" That was weird. Brandon never even cared about the cabin. I fired back. "Need to check something at home. Cover for me? Say I got called into work." Seconds later, a message came through. "Megan, you got it. Go." By the time I slipped out the back door, the party was still buzzing about Brandon's inheritance. No one noticed me leave. The drive home blurred past, streetlights streaking against the windshield. My mind a tangle of memories. Grandpa teaching me to fish off the dock. Grandpa pointing out constellations under a sky so clear it felt infinite. Grandpa laughing at my terrible attempts to skip stones. The cabin wasn't just a house. It was our place. And Brandon taking it felt like a violation of something sacred. I pulled into my driveway, barely remembering the turns I took to get there. Straight to my closet, straight to the old wooden box that had been waiting for this exact moment. It was his old cigar box, the wood worn smooth with age, still faintly carrying the scent of cedar. "Don't open this until you need to know the truth," Grandpa had told me, his eyes crinkling with quiet wisdom. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, documents neatly folded. A sealed envelope, my name scrawled across the front. And a small brass key. A key I recognized immediately. The old brass key felt heavy in my palm. I knew exactly what it unlocked. Grandpa's antique roll-top desk sat in the corner of his study at the cabin, its surface worn smooth from years of use. I had sat across from him countless times, watching as he wrote letters, balanced his checkbook, or simply traced the grain of the wood with his fingers while deep in thought. I could still hear his voice. "Some truths need to be put on paper, Olivia. That way there's no arguing with them." With a steadying breath, I turned the key and pulled the top drawer open. Inside, neatly stacked, were legal documents, and right on top, a notarized deed. I unfolded it carefully. My name. Not Brandon's. Mine. The date at the bottom, 6 months ago. Beneath the deed was a letter, written in Grandpa's familiar shaky handwriting. I unfolded it. Slowly. My dearest Olivia, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. The breath hitched in my throat. I've decided to give you the cabin while I'm still alive to avoid any complications. You're the only one who truly loved this place as much as I did. Your brother never showed interest, except when he needed a place to host parties when I wasn't around. My vision blurred as I continued reading. I know your brother might contest this, which is why I had everything properly notarized and filed. There's a copy with my lawyer, Harold Thompson. The cabin is legally yours already. This isn't part of my will or estate. I trust you to honor the spirit of our special place. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't just from grief. They were from the realization that Brandon had known exactly what he was doing. He had lied. He had stood in that living room, looked me in the eye, and fabricated a letter, knowing full well that Grandpa had already given the cabin to me. My phone buzzed. Mom. Where did you disappear to? Dad, we're still at Brandon's. Come back and celebrate. And then Brandon's message. Nice disappearing act. Don't worry, you can still visit the cabin if you ask nicely. A slow, cold anger settled over me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. Brandon knew. He had taken advantage of the fact that Grandpa wasn't here to correct him, and he had counted on me staying silent. I wouldn't. I wiped my face, tucked the documents back into the wooden box, and checked the time. The party would still be going. Perfect. The drive back to Brandon's house was a blur, but one thought played on a loop in my mind. When you have truth on your side, Olivia, you don't need to shout it from the rooftops. The quiet truth hits harder than any loud lie. Grandpa's voice again. I wasn't going to cause a scene. That wasn't my style. But I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. I parked a block away, the wooden box sitting securely on the passenger seat beside me. For a moment I just sat there, running my fingers over its worn surface. What would you do, Grandpa? I whispered. The answer came without hesitation. The right thing. With grace. I took a deep breath, picked up the box, and stepped out of the car. Before going in, I texted Megan. How many people are still there? She responded immediately. Just family now. Most guests left after dinner. Are you coming back? Yeah. I need to. The timing was perfect. No distractions. Just the people who needed to hear this. I walked up the front steps and knocked. Brandon answered, his face shifting from surprise to mild irritation. Is the work emergency over already? He asked, his tone laced with doubt. I didn't take the bait. We need to talk. Without waiting for permission, I stepped past him and into the house. The living room was exactly as I left it. Dad was flipping through Brandon's letter, inspecting it closely. Mom, already talking about renovations, barely glanced up as I entered. Vanessa sat beside her, nodding enthusiastically. Megan, sitting quietly in the corner, gave me a knowing look. Olivia's back, Mom announced, as if it were an afterthought. We were just discussing Brandon's wonderful news about the cabin. Actually, I said, setting the wooden box down on the coffee table, that's what I wanted to talk about. A flicker of recognition crossed Brandon's face. He knew. He knew exactly what was in this box. What's that? He asked, feigning curiosity. I met his gaze. Something Grandpa gave me 3 weeks ago. He asked me not to open it until the time was right. I let the words hang in the air before adding, I think that time is now. Dad sat forward, suddenly interested. What is it, Olivia? I unlatched the lid and pulled out the deed. 6 months ago, Grandpa legally transferred ownership of the vacation home to me, I said, laying the notarized document on the table for everyone to see. It's already mine. It's not part of his estate or will. Silence. Brandon's smirk faltered. The room plunged into silence. My mother's mouth fell open. My father furrowed his brow as he picked up the deed, his fingers tightening around the edges. Brandon stood frozen, his face paling by the second. Dad cleared his throat, his voice measured but firm. This is notarized. And this This is definitely your grandfather's signature. Brandon's jaw tensed. That's impossible. His voice cracked. Grandpa gave me the letter. He wanted me to have the cabin. I extended my hand. May I see that letter again? Dad hesitated, then handed it over. I placed it beside Grandpa's handwritten note from my box. The difference was glaring. Brandon's letter was an imitation, but a poor one. The strokes were too smooth, too confident. Grandpa's real handwriting had been shaky in his final months, the tremors from arthritis making even his signature waver. Mom's voice barely rose above a whisper. Brandon, did you forge this? His silence was an answer in itself. The pause stretched unbearably long before Brandon finally let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You don't understand, he muttered, shaking his head. Then explain it, I said. His hands clenched into fists. His voice wavered between defiance and desperation. It's not fair that she gets everything. I blinked. Everything. Brandon's frustration boiled over. You were always Grandpa's favorite, Olivia. Always visiting him, always helping him, always the perfect grandchild. He gestured wildly. The rest of us barely got a look in. Dad exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. Brandon, regardless of how you feel, forging your grandfather's signature is serious. Mom reached for both letters, comparing them side by side. The disbelief on her face gave way to something heavier, disappointment. Oh, Brandon, she whispered, shaking her head. How could you do this? A sharp scrape of a chair broke the silence. Vanessa stood, her face pale. I think I should go. Brandon whipped around. Vanessa, wait. This isn't what it looks like. But she was already gathering her purse, avoiding his pleading gaze. She walked briskly to the door, pausing only for a second before slipping out and closing it firmly behind her. Brandon let out a harsh exhale, hands dragging through his hair. The weight of the moment settled over the room. Megan caught my eye, offering a small supportive nod. She had always seen through Brandon's antics, even when our parents couldn't. Dad finally broke the silence. I don't understand. His voice was quieter now, filled with something dangerously close to sorrow. Why would you announce something like this without even checking if it was true? The will reading isn't even until next week. Brandon's face flushed. Because I already knew. Everyone turned to him. He swallowed hard before continuing. I was at Grandpa's lawyer's office last week, asking about the estate. Thompson mentioned the cabin wasn't part of it because it had already been handled. He let out a bitter chuckle. He wouldn't give me any details, but I knew what it meant. Mom folded her arms. So you thought if you announced it first, what? That Olivia would just go along with it. Brandon's jaw clenched. Maybe everyone would believe me instead of her for once. His voice rose, frustration seeping into every word. Maybe I could have something that mattered to Grandpa too. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. And for the first time I saw it, the truth beneath his anger. This wasn't just about the cabin. It never had been. He had felt forgotten. I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy despite everything. Brandon, I said, my voice softer now. Grandpa invited you to the cabin countless times. You always said you were too busy. His lips pressed into a thin line. Because I felt like an intruder, he shot back. By the time I realized what I was missing, it was too late. You two had your special bond, your inside jokes, your traditions. There was no room for me. Dad shook his head, the disappointment deep in his expression. That doesn't justify lying to the entire family, son. Brandon exhaled sharply and slumped into a chair. So what happens now? He didn't look at me. You've made your point, Olivia. You win. I studied him for a long moment. This isn't about winning, I said quietly. I thought of Grandpa, of all the lessons he had taught me. I thought of the way he had always treated Brandon, not as an outsider, but as someone who just refused to step in. Despite everything Brandon had done, Grandpa had still wanted him to have something. I reached back into the wooden box and pulled out an envelope I hadn't mentioned yet. It was sealed, and Brandon's name was written across it in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. He left something for you too, I said, holding it out. Brandon's eyes flicked from me to the envelope, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. What is it? I don't know, I admitted. Grandpa told me not to open anything that wasn't addressed to me. Brandon hesitated. Then cautiously he took the envelope and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the letter. His breath hitched. His face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, guilt, something that looked like regret. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. He knew. Mom leaned in concerned. "What does it say, honey?" Brandon swallowed, then passed her the letter. "Read it," he said. "Everyone should hear it." Mom adjusted her glasses and began. "Dear Brandon, if you're reading this, then Olivia has opened my cedar box, which means one of two things. Either I'm gone, or something has happened that made her feel it was necessary to reveal its contents. I've known you since the day you were born, and I know your heart. You've always wanted recognition and validation, things I perhaps failed to give you in the way you needed. But I also know that when you feel overlooked, you sometimes make impulsive decisions that hurt others and, ultimately, yourself. The cabin has been transferred to Olivia. This was a decision I made with great thought and love. Not because I didn't care for you, but because Olivia connected with the place in a way you never did." Mom's voice wavered slightly as she read Grandpa's words aloud, the weight of them settling over the room. "She understood what made it special to me, and I trust her to preserve that spirit. What you need isn't a property, Brandon. It's a purpose." Brandon's fingers clenched around the letter, his knuckles white. "I've enclosed a check for $25,000. Use it to start something meaningful. Find what makes your heart come alive the way the cabin does for Olivia. Maybe it's that business idea you mentioned last Christmas, or perhaps something else entirely." My mother's voice softened, her eyes glassy as she continued. "I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about favorites or fairness. It's about recognizing different paths for different hearts. Olivia will keep the door open for you at the cabin, I have no doubt. But your future lies in building something of your own." A pause. A breath. "With love and hope, Grandpa." When she finished reading, the room was silent. Not the suffocating silence of accusation or tension, but something deeper. Grief, understanding. The unraveling of something that had been tangled for years. Brandon sat motionless, the check trembling in his grasp. "He saw right through me," he murmured almost to himself. "Even from the grave." Dad stepped forward, his hand resting on Brandon's shoulder, not in disappointment but in something closer to reassurance. "Your grandfather was a perceptive man." Brandon exhaled shakily, then turned to me. For the first time in years, he really looked at me. Not as competition, not with resentment, but as a sister he had wronged. "I'm sorry, Olivia," he said, his voice raw. "I had no right to try and take what was already yours." The words seemed to cost him, but they also felt sincere. I studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." I wasn't ready to offer full forgiveness, not yet. But acknowledging his apology was a start. I hesitated, then reached for the wooden box again. "There's something else," I said, lifting out a small, well-worn photo album. I flipped it open to the first page. A picture of us as kids at the cabin, Brandon and me, knee-deep in lake water, building lopsided sandcastles. Another of Grandpa holding a tiny Brandon on his shoulders. One of all three of us at the fire pit, marshmallows melting into flames. Brandon leaned in, his face flickering through recognition, surprise, and something that looked like regret. "He kept this in his desk at the cabin," I said, turning the pages slowly. The photos shifted from childhood to more recent years. Me helping Grandpa fix the dock, stacking firewood, the two of us sitting on the porch swing, laughing at something I couldn't remember now. I glanced at Brandon. "He never stopped hoping you'd come around." Brandon swallowed hard. His hand hovered over the album but didn't touch it. "I really messed up, didn't I?" His voice was quieter now. I didn't sugarcoat it. "Yeah." His eyes flickered toward mine, waiting, uncertain. "But Grandpa obviously thought you could do better." The silence that followed was heavy, but not with anger. It was the weight of realization, of a long overdue reckoning. Megan, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "So what happens now?" It was the question hanging over all of us. What do you do after betrayal? After painful truths are laid bare? How do you move forward? I ran my fingers over the wooden box, feeling the weight of responsibility Grandpa had placed on me. Not just for the cabin, but maybe for something bigger. I took a breath. Now, I said softly, we try to honor what Grandpa wanted. For both of us. The gathering broke apart soon after. Mom and Dad left, glancing back at Brandon, torn between disappointment and concern. Megan gave me a quick hug, whispering, "Call me tomorrow." Then it was just me and Brandon in his new house, where the celebratory energy had long since evaporated. He moved around the kitchen, mechanically making coffee neither of us really wanted. The silence between us stretched, thick with years of competition and misunderstanding. Finally, he set a mug in front of me and exhaled. I didn't plan it. I raised an eyebrow. The forgery? He shook his head, staring down at his cup. Not at first. When I found out about the deed, I was angry. Hurt. I made the letter that night, but I wasn't actually going to use it. Then why did you? Brandon let out a bitter chuckle, rubbing a hand down his face. Because tonight, I wanted more. I frowned. More. His shoulders slumped. Everyone was here celebrating my new house. But I wanted something bigger. Something that made me feel like I had a real place in the family. He looked up and for the first time I saw the insecurity. Beneath all his arrogance. I've always been jealous of what you had with Grandpa, he admitted. I sighed. You could have had it too. His expression faltered. I know that now. But I was too proud. Too stubborn to see it. A beat of silence. Then hesitantly he asked, "What are you going to do with the cabin?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since Grandpa gave me the deed 6 months ago. I stared into my coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. I don't know yet, I admitted. But whatever I do, I want it to honor him. For the first time in years, Brandon didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. That's the right answer. Keep it as it is mostly, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the night. It needs some repairs, but I don't want to change its character. Brandon nodded, exhaling as if he'd been holding something in. That's good. It should stay the way Grandpa loved it. I studied him. This person I'd grown up with yet sometimes felt like a stranger. There were years between us, not in age but in understanding. You're welcome there, you know. Anytime. His brows lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected that. Even after what I did. I hesitated, but only for a moment. The cabin was meant to bring family together, not drive us apart. The words felt right, something Grandpa would have said. I met his gaze, making sure he heard the next part. That doesn't mean I'm not still angry, or that I trust you completely right now. But the door is open. Brandon swallowed, nodding slowly. He understood what this was, a second chance, not a free pass. Thank you, he murmured. We sat in silence, both staring into our coffee mugs. The liquid had gone cold, but neither of us made a move to get up. The exhaustion of the night pressed down on my shoulders, not just from what had happened, but from the years that had led up to it. Finally, I set my cup down and stood. I should go. It's been a long night. Brandon followed me to the door, hesitating as I reached for the handle. Do you think Grandpa knew this would happen? He asked. The whole fight over the cabin? I thought of the careful way Grandpa had planned everything. The notarized deed, the letters, his instructions to me about when to open the box. He had known. Not just about the cabin but about Brandon. About all of us. I think he hoped it wouldn't, I admitted. But he was prepared in case it did. Brandon let out a soft, rueful laugh. He always was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. That he was, I said, offering the smallest of smiles. I stepped outside, the cool night air pressing against my skin. As I drove home, the wooden box sat securely on the passenger seat beside me, carrying not just documents, but the echoes of a man who had understood his family better than we'd understood ourselves. I felt everything. Sadness, exhaustion, relief. But somewhere beneath it all was something softer. Something almost unfamiliar. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was a turning point. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cabin keys. They felt heavier than before, not just metal but the weight of responsibility, of memory, of trust. Grandpa had left me something precious. And I intended to honor that. But maybe if Brandon was willing to meet me halfway, there was room for him in that picture too. The cabin. Morning sunlight spilled through the trees as I pulled into the gravel driveway, shadows stretching long across the ground. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, crisp in that unmistakable way of the mountains. And there it was. The cabin. It stood exactly as I remembered. Weathered cedar siding, emerald green shutters, the wide porch wrapping around three sides like an open-armed embrace. The sight of it settled something in me, a quiet confirmation that I was home. I sat in the car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, just taking it in. This place wasn't just mine now. It wasn't just a building or a piece of property. It was a sanctuary, a living, breathing collection of memories. I could almost see Grandpa sitting on the porch, rocking gently in his favorite chair, baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I smiled to myself as I stepped out of the car. The key slid into the lock, sticking just slightly, just like it always had. Grandpa had refused to fix it, claiming it kept out the riffraff. I jiggled it just the way he'd shown me, and the door creaked open. The moment I stepped inside, it hit me. The scent of aged wood, lake water, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco, despite Grandpa's doctor telling him to quit years ago. The air held a stillness, not eerie but expectant, as if the cabin itself was waiting to see what I would do next. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Books stacked haphazardly on the side table. Fishing gear neatly tucked into the corner. Every reel and lure in its proper place. The old quilt draped over the couch, worn soft by decades of use. I ran my fingers along the back of Grandpa's chair, feeling the smooth grooves where his hands had rested for years. This place wasn't just a home. It was a legacy. And for the first time since he'd passed, I didn't just feel the weight of responsibility. I felt him. A presence, a whisper, a quiet knowing. Grandpa had trusted me with this place. And I wouldn't let him down. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Megan. "How's the cabin? Your mom called me this morning. Brandon is a wreck." I hesitated before typing back. "Cabin's perfect. Not sure how to feel about Brandon yet." Her response came quickly. "He's been calling everyone, trying to explain himself. Your parents are still pretty upset." I wasn't surprised. The fallout from last night's revelations would take time to settle. Trust, once broken, didn't mend overnight. Setting my phone aside, I walked to the large picture window overlooking the lake. The water shimmered under the morning sun, calm and unchanging, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around it. "I'm here, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room. "I'll take good care of it. I promise." 3 weeks passed before Brandon reached out. His message was simple. "Can we talk? At the cabin, maybe?" I waited a full day before responding. Saturday, 10 a.m. I wasn't ready to share this space with him. Not yet. But Grandpa's words kept nudging at me. "Holding grudges makes the heart heavy, Olivia. Sometimes forgiveness is more for you than for them." So I agreed. On Saturday morning, I sat on the porch swing, a warm cup of coffee in my hands, watching as Brandon's car pulled up the gravel drive. He stepped out slowly, looking different. Less certain. "This place hasn't changed at all," he said, eyes scanning the familiar landscape. "That's the idea," I replied, nodding toward the chair across from me. He hesitated, then sat, fingers drumming lightly against his knees. "I've been thinking about what to say for weeks," he admitted, staring out at the lake. "But everything sounds inadequate." "Try anyway," I said, my tone neutral, neither welcoming nor cold. Brandon took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. Not just for the forgery but for everything. For being jealous of your relationship with Grandpa. For resenting you when I should have been looking at my own choices." I studied him, searching for sincerity. Brandon had always been good at saying what people wanted to hear. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "The truth, Brandon." He looked down, silent for a long moment. "I thought if I had the cabin, it would somehow make up for all the time I didn't spend here. Like I could buy back those moments I missed." His voice cracked slightly. "Stupid, right?" I softened just a little. Not an excuse. Just a sad, misguided truth. Then unexpectedly he blurted out, "I used the money." I frowned. "Grandpa's check." He nodded. "I enrolled in that woodworking course he was always telling me to try. The one I was too busy for." A self-deprecating laugh escaped him. "Turns out I'm terrible at it, but I'm going to stick with it." He was right. It's calming. Being focused on creating something with your hands. It was a small thing. But for Brandon, it was something. He would have liked that, I said quietly. For a while we just sat, listening to the lake, the wind, the occasional bird call. The same peaceful soundtrack that had accompanied so many conversations between Grandpa and me over the years. Finally I stood. I have something to show you. Brandon followed me inside into Grandpa's study, where the antique roll-top desk stood, bathed in morning light. From my pocket, I pulled out the small brass key from the wooden box and unlocked it. Inside, the compartments were filled with neatly organized papers, old letters, and small mementos. I pulled out a folder labeled Brandon and handed it to him. His brows furrowed as he opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings from his high school debate championship, photos of his college graduation, a printout of the webpage announcing his promotion last year. Brandon swallowed hard. I had no idea he kept track of all this. He was proud of you, I said softly. He just showed it differently than you wanted. Brandon's fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages. There's a folder for each of us, I added. He called it his brag book. He looked up, eyes glistening. I really messed up, didn't I? Yes, I admitted. But Grandpa believed in second chances. And so do I. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small calendar. I've marked the weekends I'll be up here for maintenance and bigger projects. I could use an extra set of hands, even terrible woodworking ones. Brandon blinked, then let out a small, surprised laugh. Really? I nodded. The cabin was meant to bring family together, not tear us apart. That's what Grandpa wanted. Later that afternoon, we sat at the edge of the dock, feet dangling in the cool water. Brandon pitched ideas for fixing up the boathouse while I sketched possibilities in a notebook. For the first time in years, our conversation wasn't filled with competition, resentment, or old wounds. Just plans. A quiet understanding. You know, Brandon said, staring out at the water. I think Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing giving you this place. I glanced at him. What do you mean? He kicked at the water gently, watching the ripples spread. You didn't just inherit a cabin, Olivia. He turned toward me, thoughtful. You inherited his role, keeping the family connected to what matters. I exhaled slowly, letting his words settle. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting golden light across the lake, I realized something. Grandpa hadn't just left me a piece of property. He'd given me a chance to heal old wounds, a chance to build something new, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to bring my brother back to the family he'd nearly lost to resentment and pride. A new beginning. For both of us.